Earlier this year during Lent, I had an idea. Someone put a poll in my Discord asking what everyone was going to do during Lent. In this poll, he included options like Patristic Lent, Medieval Lent, and Baroque Lent. At the time, I didn't know much about the history of fasting seasons, so I began to do research, finding out the story of the changes in the Church's fasting seasons, slowly over time getting more and more and more lax. But there was something else that I found to be fascinating. When I looked into the primary sources of the changing rules on fasting, the popes and other authors kept repeating the same thing over and over again. They kept encouraging people who can to keep the earlier practice, going beyond the laxity of current discipline. Pope Clement XIII, for example, stated, quote, "Your work and zeal should recall the discipline of the Lenten fast, now weakened by many corruptions, to its original observance," end quote. So I had a thought. What if I took what these popes said seriously? What if I fasted like St. Thomas would have fasted? So I continued my research and drew up a rule where I outlined how the Church in the time of St. Thomas would have fasted during Lent. I told others about this idea, and many found it fascinating, so they decided to join me, some of whom have never fasted their entire lives. For the next 40 days, we all kept the same rule and all persevered into the end, even intensifying the fast during Holy Week. For Advent this year, I've decided to do the same thing. So here's the history of the Advent fast. We do not have much information about the origins of the Advent season, but we do know that it was celebrated at least as far back as the 4th century. Yet it seems reasonable to assume that it goes back as far as the celebration of Christmas itself. When there are major feast days, there was always a season of fasting before them. Since Easter is the greatest of the feast days, there's a significant period of fasting before Easter. Hence the same goes for Christmas. Lent is to Easter what Advent is to Christmas. This parallel is actually kept in the earliest records we have for the Advent fast. The Advent fast was not originally called the Advent fast, but St. Martin's Lent. The reason for this name had to do with the fact that there was an understanding that the fasting period should last 40 days, just as it does for Lent. Hence, rather than beginning at the beginning of the season of Advent, they began a few weeks earlier on November 11th, which happened to be the feast of St. Martin. Hence it was called St. Martin's Lent, or St. Martin's 40 days. During this period, we don't see as universal of a rule as we do in the descriptions of the Lenten fast. For example, St. Gregory of Tours reported that the practice during his time was that the faithful fasted 3 times a week until Christmas. On the other hand, in the East, John the Faster enforced a complete abstinence from flesh meats during this period in the 6th century. Chodagand, Bishop of Metz, enforced upon clerics a daily abstinence and fast until the 9th hour. Here it is important to note a few terms for the unfamiliar. When we speak about fasting, we are speaking about time periods of not eating, or in some cases, both not eating and not drinking. This period of fasting was broken by a single meal. In different ages of the Church, this single meal was held at different times. In the earliest period of the Church, this was broken at sundown. Later, this time was moved back to the 9th hour, which is 3 p.m. By the time of the Reformation, this was moved back even further to noon. We actually get our modern term noon from this corruption. Noon comes from the hour of non, which is supposed to be prayed at the 9th hour, that is 3 p.m., but was moved back earlier into the day so that the meal could be eaten earlier in the day. This earlier meal led to further corruptions, including what is known as a collation, or a small meal that was eaten before bed. By the 18th century, it also becomes standard to add in a little bit of food in the morning as well. So basically, it went from don't eat or drink anything until sundown to eat a little snack for breakfast, have a normal lunch, and then have a light dinner. Now, fasting is different from abstinence. Abstinence doesn't involve how much you eat or when you eat, but what you eat. This also became loosened over time. Originally, there were 3 main categories of forbidden foods: meat, fish, and dairy. But there were also others that fell under this as well, such as oils and wine. But the main 3 were meat, fish, and dairy. Yet, even in the patristic era, there are authors who accept fish from this prohibition. By the 19th century, dairy became de facto permitted in many places as well, although the practice was not uniform. So in our above examples, when it mentions abstinence during these entire periods, what was envisioned was that there was at least no meat, wine, and dairy being eaten for the entire 40 days, and sometimes fish and oil were included as well. The basic standard practice was established of 3 things. First, it was 40 days long, just like the Lenten fast. Second, there was abstinence from forbidden foods for all 40 days. Third, for laymen, the fasting days were Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, which was not as intense as Lent, since Lent was every day for both fasting and abstinence. As noted by Garanger, quote, "We find the 9th canon of the First Council of Macon held in 582, ordaining that during the same interval between St. Martin's Day and Christmas, the Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays should be fasting days. Not many years before that, namely in 567, the Second Council of Tours had enjoined the monks to fast from the beginning of December until Christmas. End quote. After this point, there was two divergent trends, one towards intensification and the other towards laxity. The first trend led to the practice of the monks of fasting each day to be enjoined upon the laity around the 7th and 8th century. The second trend led to the shortening of Lent from the original 40 days to 4 weeks, from which we have our current computation of Advent. The fathers during this period, such as St. Isidore and Rabanus Maurus, saw the 40-day computation of St. Martin's Lent as of divine origin, pointing back to the fast instituted by Jeremiah. This led to the full 40-day period being practiced by many, even after it was not ecclesiastically approbated. During the period of the high and late medieval era, there was a constant push back and forth between laxity and great rigor, although none surpassing the heights reached in the earlier era. Some went so far as to remove fasting altogether, and to keep the period only as a period of abstinence. Even worse, it seems that in some areas the laymen did not even practice it at all. It was only practiced by clerics. Yet in other churches, especially those renowned for their devotion, we find a certain middle way emerging. While the fast did not extend the entire 40-day period like it had before, it did go beyond the original practice of Monday, Wednesday, and Friday fasting to include every day, besides Sunday, of course. As noted by Garanger, quote, "We find Pope Innocent III in his letter to the Bishop of Braga mentioning the custom of fasting during the whole of Advent as being at that time observed in Rome. And Durandus, in the same 13th century, in his Rationale on the Divine Offices, tells us that in France, fasting was uninterruptedly observed during the whole of that holy time." End quote. Yet when we compare the two practices, the late patristic and the high medieval practices actually align. If one counts the number of days fasted in the late patristic period, on average, it is going to be around 19 days of fasting. Yet if one does the same thing with the Advent practice, excluding Sundays, on average, it is going to be around 21 days. Here, while the two practices seem to depart greatly, they average out to around the same number of fasting days. Yet after this period, the practice began to decay more and more, until only a remnant of it was left behind in the Advent days of abstinence in the Roman Rite. Yet the saints constantly encouraged the people to remember the ancient discipline, and to strive to conform themselves to it. As noted by St. Charles Borromeo's biographer Giovanni Pietro Guisano, quote, "In St. Charles had long desired to restore a certain pious observance which had fallen into neglect. This was the observance of Advent, when the offices of the Church are more full than at any other time, and set before us the most beautiful mysteries of the faith, the whole season having at one time been kept as a daily fast, with other holy exercises. St. Charles had begun some days before to observe the fast, and had made it a rule with his household to observe an abstinence from meat and milk diet during the season, and fasting on 2 or 3 days in each week. In 1573, on the approach of Advent, he determined to stir up the people to sanctify it with fasting and works of piety, conformably with the intention of Holy Church. He accordingly published a pastoral letter, in which he gave an exposition of the rites and mysteries commemorated by the Church during that season. He exhorted the people to the practice of mortification as a fitting preparation for the Feast of the Nativity, recommending them to observe the whole season as a fast, or at least some days in the week, and to practice works of charity and piety, concluded with severe strictures on the recklessness of those who conform to the corrupt custom of spending these solemn days in unseasonable and profane conviviality. Yet even to this day, there is still such a practice in the Eastern churches, although it begins at the fast of St. Philip, rather than at the feast of St. Martin. As noted by Garanger, quote, "The Eastern Church still continues to observe the fast of Advent, although with much less rigor than that of Lent. It consists of 40 days beginning with November 14th, the day on which this church keeps the feast of the Apostle St. Philip. During this entire period, the people abstain from flesh, meat, butter, milk, and eggs, but they are allowed, which they are not allowed during Lent, fish, oil, and wine. Fasting in the strict sense is binding only on 7 out of the 40 days, and the whole period goes under the name of St. Philip's Lent." End quote. There are remnants of this ancient practice that continued up until the early 20th century, with Wednesdays and Advent being included with Fridays as days of abstinence and fasting. Yet the Church continues to state her intention that this period of time be celebrated as a penitential season, even if the letter of the law does not require it of us. Venerable Pius XII notes that, quote, "In the period of Advent, the Church arouses in us the conscientiousness of the sins we have had the misfortune to commit, and urges us, by restraining our desires and practicing voluntary mortification of the body, to recollect ourselves in meditation, and experience a longing desire to return to God, who alone can free us by His grace from the stain of sin and from its evil consequences." End quote. This was also something insisted upon by St. John Paul II in 2001 in light of the recent terrorist attacks in September of that year and the beginning of the War on Terror. In fact, in light of this, the Instrumentum Laboris of the 2005 Synod specifically mentions a re-emphasis on the penitential character of Lent against the secularization of this season, especially by an increase of confessions during this season. Quote, "Greater effort is needed in providing the opportunity for individual confessions. This could possibly be done in conjunction with neighboring parishes, not only on Saturdays and Sundays, but especially during Advent and Lent. Through preaching and catechesis, much can be accomplished to restore a sense of sin and penitential practice, which will counteract the difficulties resulting from a secularized mentality." End quote. This aspect of conversion or repentance was emphasized in another document given by the Congregation for Divine Worship in 2001 called the Directory on Popular Piety in the Liturgy, where it notes that, quote, "Advent is a time of waiting, conversion, and of hope," specifically pointing to the penitential character of the Advent liturgy, especially the prevalence of St. John the Baptist in the liturgy. It goes on to say that it is only this penitential character that will help us Catholics overcome the commercialization of Christmas. Quote, "Popular piety, because of its intuitive understanding of the Christian mystery, can contribute effectively to the conservation of many of the values of Advent, which are not infrequently threatened by the commercialization of Christmas and consumer superficiality. Popular piety perceives that it is impossible to celebrate the Lord's birth except in an atmosphere of sobriety and joyous simplicity, and of concern for the poor and marginalized. Popular piety intuitively understands that it is not possible coherently to celebrate the birth of Him who saves His people from their sins without some effort to overcome sin in one's own life, while waiting vigilantly for Him who will return at the end of time." End quote. Before we go on to speak of a practical rule during this season, it is important to note how relevant these exhortations are to us today. How many of you experience the season before Christmas as a time of indulgence and materialism? How many of you are so wrapped up in the spirit of indulgence that you almost never consider Advent as a preparation for the second coming of Christ? I could go on, but each of us recognizes how fundamentally broken our experience of Advent is. Before Christmas, we fast. After Christmas, we feast. Just as it would be completely absurd to have indulgent meals during Lent rather than waiting for Easter, so also it is completely absurd to have indulgent meals during Advent rather than waiting for Christmas. So what are those practices that we can bring back in order to conform ourselves to the ancient custom? In order to determine this, you should make decisions on 3 questions. First, let's consider timing. While it would be ideal to bring back the preparation for Christmas as a 40-day season, this does not seem to be realistic, especially with the American celebration of Thanksgiving occurring during this time. Perhaps one could treat the period from November 11th to the beginning of Advent kind of like how we treat Septuagesima, as a period to begin to add some penitential practices without doing the full thing. Second, let's consider abstinence. Here, one has a number of different options. First, what kinds of food are we going to abstain from? At the first level, one necessarily should abstain from meat. Yet it is better to go beyond this, abstaining from dairy products as well. Optionally abstaining from fish, wine, or oil would reflect certain ancient customs, although even the ancients were usually not as strict about these as during Lent. Second, which days are you going to abstain on? Ancient custom has it that the entire season should keep the rule of abstinence. Even the reform movements bringing back the Advent fast always had the abstinence perpetual during the season. The idea that such abstinence should only include Wednesdays beyond the ordinary Friday fast is an innovation. Although since this is voluntary, there's nothing wrong with following the innovation. Yet it is highly encouraged to make it perpetual, from the beginning of Advent until the Christmas Eve Mass. Third, let's consider fasting. Here there are even more options. First, are you going to take a collation? The traditional practice is to only eat a single meal, nothing else. Yet, as a matter of relaxation, a small snack before bed was initially granted in the medieval era. Later, a small bite of food in the morning was added. Eventually, this led to the odd practice of having 1 full meal and 2 partial meals, along with the practice of the partial abstinence, where meat was granted for the main meal. Personally, once collations become multiplied, I don't really see the point in fasting. Second, when are you going to break your fast? There are 3 options from the tradition: sundown, 3 p.m., or noon. This is a matter of personal preference and dependent on whether you will have a collation or not. Third, how often are you going to fast? Here, even from ancient times, there are 2 practices. either being perpetual or Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Again, this is obviously voluntary and hence optional, but it seems to me that the perpetual practice is more fitting due to the shortening of the season. Although reform movements often simply encourage the faithful to fast 3 times a week rather than the entire season. Since I want to adhere as closely as possible to the practice of St. Thomas during this holy season, the rule that me and my friends are going to follow is going to be the following. First, abstaining from meat and dairy every day during the entire season. Second, fasting every day during the entire season until 3 p.m. with a collation in the evening. I pray that this was helpful to you and that you will decide to do penance during this Advent. In order to help with your decision, I decided to include an overview of the Catholic theology of fasting before we end this video. Hello everyone, I wanted to announce this year's end-of-year fundraiser. I do the end-of-year fundraiser every single year in December to try to get us off to a good start before we go into the next year. And this year I wanted to do things slightly differently. Rather than getting an absolute number of pledges like I do every other year, which if you want to give an absolute number, I won't complain. I want to look for monthly pledges, recurring pledges every single month in order to keep a good amount of stability, be able to hire other people to do more work, be able to work more on long-term projects rather than short-term projects. So if you're interested in this and you want to help out the apostolate for the coming years, please go to christianbwagner.com/donate and give a pledge of any amount. Our goal is $3,000 in monthly pledges for the upcoming year. We'll be having a giveaway and a lot of other announcements. For more information, go to christianbwagner.com/donate.